The fighting in the Gaza Strip continued over this weekend, with hundreds of terrorists eliminated and terror infrastructure destroyed, while over 800,000 residents are estimated to have left Gaza City as the barrier of fear is gone. And after the speech by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel at the United Nations General Assembly, now all eyes turn to his meeting with US President Donald Trump, who has a 21-point plan that encompasses not only the release of the hostages and an end to the war in the Gaza Strip, but issues related to the Palestinian Authority administrated areas in Judea and Samaria as well. And we will bring you all the details of this American plan. And meanwhile, Europe's leaders are surrendering to fringe groups, and according to the intelligence echelon, Israel must prepare for extreme scenarios. As part of those preparations, the United States ambassador to Israel will hold a historic visit in Egypt this week, and we'll take a look at some of the issues that will be on the table. And to the north, there's another set of issues to discuss between Israel and the al-Jolani regime in Syria. Many are asking what Israel would gain from an agreement with this regime, and we'll take a closer look at this situation. And further afield, snapback sanctions have been reimposed on Iran following the failure of nuclear negotiations, and of course, the Ayatollah regime is doing the only thing that it knows how to do, threatening the European powers and making dark predictions about their imminent demise. Welcome to Boots on the Ground. I'm your host Yair Pinto, and together with me is Mati Shoshani, and we bring you the news report that gathers all the truth about what's happening in Israel. So the IDF stated over the past 24 hours that terrorists were eliminated and forces located many weapons as well pushed deeper into Gaza City, and according to the estimates, over 800,000 residents, Palestinian residents, have left the city, moving south to humanitarian areas. This makes it much easier for the IDF to conduct the necessary maneuvers inside the city, but their movements are still hampered by hardcore resistance who remain terrorists of Hamas. However, United States President Donald Trump has a 21-point plan of wrapping up all the issues related to the Palestinians, and TBN Israel senior Middle East analyst Mati Shoshani will bring us all the details. And to give you some hints, the plan includes dismantling the refugee camps, canceling refugee statuses, and removing UNRWA from Judea and Samaria. Israeli intelligence officials assess with high probability that the United States President's 21-point plan will be implemented, and noted that most of the clauses suit Israel. But the Prime Minister seeks to amend some of them before his meeting with the President at the White House on Monday. And in Jerusalem, they blamed Doha, Qatar, for the international pressure and the sanctions against Israel, and warn of a coordinated move that also Spain and Morocco will be included in. In other news, as tensions between Israel and Egypt over the war in the Gaza Strip simmer, Ambassador Mike Huckabee is expected to visit Cairo in the coming days, marking the first official visit in that location in decades by a sitting American ambassador. And according to the New York Times, the talks he will hold there with senior Egyptian officials will focus on campaign in the Gaza Strip and on President Trump's new plan to end it. And elsewhere, the snapback mechanism for sanctions on Iran has come into force after an effort to delay them by the Chinese and the Russians at the Security Council have failed. Now, after a decade, the heavy United Nations sanctions on Iran have returned, including an embargo on arms, freezing Iranian assets worldwide, and banning the entry of Iranians into various countries. And amidst these developments, a senior official in Iran denied access to the IAEA inspectors at several nuclear facilities, and Iranian ambassadors in Germany, France, and Britain were summoned for consultations in light of the return of the United Nations sanctions. For his part, Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, had mocking words for Netanyahu, captioning a photo from the United Nations speech when many countries and delegations walked out with the words, "the most isolated entity in the world," according to Khamenei. He wasn't the only one commenting on the mass walkout, which also grabbed headlines around the world. And we have a lot of details to share with you about this situation, so let's dive into them. I'm Yair Pinto, and this is your Boots on the Ground report about what's happening in Israel on day 723 of the war against Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis in Yemen, the Shia militias in Iraq, and all the other armed groups in this region that are taking their orders from Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, which is the head of the crumbling axis of evil in the Middle East. So a moment before we begin, I want to call on you to help us spread the truth. You can do this by sharing these videos, following us on social media. Just make sure to follow only official accounts of Yair Pinto and Mati Shoshani. And then you can leave a comment, hit the like button, and most importantly, hit that subscribe button so that you never miss another episode of Boots on the Ground. So the combat team forces of the Givati Infantry Brigade under Division 162nd Command are now fighting in the area of the village of Jabalia in Gaza Strip and on the outskirts of Gaza City in the northern parts of the Gaza Strip. So the IDF said that the activity of the forces on the outskirts of Gaza City enables the expanding of the fighting deeper into the area and preventing the entrenchment of terrorist organizations there. On Saturday evening, the IDF spokesperson's unit published footage of terrorists being eliminated from the air in Gaza City after they were identified digging into the ground to plant explosives. In a precise strike by the Israeli aircrafts, the terrorists were eliminated with no casualties to our forces. And over the weekend, the IDF announced that a suicide bomber wearing an explosive vest was eliminated near army forces in Gaza City. And according to the IDF, Division 98 forces that identified him directed an airstrike at him. After he was hit, they also noticed secondary explosions which indicated the presence of explosive devices on him. Additionally, during the last 24 hours, terrorists were eliminated and the forces located many weapons including anti-tank missiles, rockets, explosive charges, and firearms, and Division 162nd forces operating in Gaza City struck a building from which Hamas terrorists were observing the IDF forces, as well as underground terrorist infrastructures, and neutralized explosive charges planted in these areas. Division 36 forces also continued fighting in the Gaza City area, and in the last 24 hours, terrorist infrastructures above and below the ground were destroyed, and terrorists who posed a threat to the forces were eliminated. On Saturday evening, the IDF began for the first time to carry out ground operations in the area of the El Sabra neighborhood in Gaza, indicating a deepening of the ground maneuver. The operation was preceded by the deliberate detonation of booby-trapped APCs by IDF engineering forces against terrorist infrastructure also on El Nasser and the al-Jolani streets in the city. The Air Force has also been in action, as over the last 24 hours, the Air Force struck about 120 targets, including military buildings, terrorists, and additional terrorist infrastructure. And amidst all of this kinetic activity, according to sources in Southern Command of the IDF, more than 800,000 Palestinian residents have left Gaza City and moved south, despite Hamas threats and attempts to prevent them from crossing. However, there are still population concentrations of a little over 200,000 people in tents and buildings that serve as a human shield for Hamas. The movement of most of the residents out of the city was not an accident, but the result of a three-phased plan that the IDF implemented in recent weeks. The first step was the massive distribution of leaflets, mostly dropped from the air, while the Palestinian public was unsure of the IDF's intent and whether it would really maneuver into the heart of Gaza City. The second step was targeted strikes towards Gaza City, which were worth doing for their own sake, but also served the purpose of convincing large numbers of residents that the IDF meant business and that they needed to take the evacuation orders seriously. But still, large numbers of residents only began moving out of the city when massive strikes began, including the demolition of high-rise towers that Hamas was using for observation and communications. This was accompanied by troops movements into the central neighborhoods of the city, and in recent nights, the IDF has increased the rate of the fire against the terrorist targets, and every night the Air Force has struck more than 130 targets. The IDF is expanding the areas of Gaza City under its direct control to 2 areas where there are concentration of population that fled their homes from the combat zones and are living in tents in the Rimal neighborhood and at Gaza port. Moving the population from the area will lead to a critical stage in this war, since the next stage will be aimed at the hardcore of Gaza City, where thousands of Hamas terrorists are concentrated. And here, at TBN Israel, we will continue to report on every development in this ground war against the Hamas terrorist organization in Gaza. So keep spreading the truth, share, and follow us. And most importantly, hit that subscribe button. Now, I want to tell you a short story about why we are fighting this war. 2-year-old Hadar was riding with her mother near Shiloh, north of Jerusalem, when a terrorist drove straight into them. She fought for her life in intensive care, but after a few days of this fight, she was gone. Her 5 siblings were left behind in pieces, terrified, silent, and broken. But thanks to the Shiloh Israel Children's Fund, they began trauma therapy, and slowly they started to heal. But they're not alone. Thousands of Israeli children carry invisible wounds from terror and from war. They suffer from nightmares and anxiety, and many of them suffer in silence, worrying that no one will understand, and if they speak up, it will only cause them more problems. Shiloh Israel Children's Fund gives these children the tools to rebuild. Through creative therapies, including art, music, and movement, they learn to express the pain that they cannot explain. And step by step, they find their way back to life. Since October 7th, the need has surged beyond capability. Shiloh Israel Children's Fund now brings therapy directly to the affected communities and offers open studio sessions for early intervention. This is urgent. These children are the future of Israel, and they need us now. So if you want to help, go to israelchildren.org/help. Again, that's israelchildren.org/help. Don't look away, don't wait, be part that a child is healing during this hard time. And now, we'll move to TBN Israel's senior Middle East analyst Mati Shoshani, who will bring us a look at all the issues likely to be discussed by President Donald Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu during their meeting at the White House on Monday. So according to rumors, the plan that Washington formulated for the day after the war in the Gaza Strip includes not only rebuilding Gaza and returning control to the Palestinian Authority, but also far-reaching changes in Judea and Samaria. According to diplomatic sources, this is a comprehensive step intended to fundamentally change the structure of the authority, the status of Palestinians in the refugee camps, and UNRWA's involvement in this area. So Mati, what's going on?
Indeed, these have been dramatic, fast-paced, and historic moments in the UN General Assembly. In fact, it would be fair to say that the world's focus, the center point of international geopolitics, is once again in New York, at least for the time being. Between the speeches made by Prime Minister Netanyahu this last weekend, the speech made by President Donald Trump, and of course multiple speeches made by other countries recognizing a Palestinian state in a unilateral way, it has been very, very significant on multiple fronts. And over the next couple minutes, we're going to break down the dramatic, unique change of events that is taking place, what it means for us, what it means for the world, and what truly is going to happen in the Middle East. Now first, let's start with the negative. The negative is that multiple European countries have recognized the Palestinian state, and they've done so unilaterally. They've done so without consulting with Israel, against the advice of the US, and without any substantial, clear, or true plan forward on this. They don't know who is going to lead the Palestinian Authority. They have no plan for what's going to happen in Gaza and the day after. There is no plan to remove Hamas in these statements. And in fact, it all sounds like one big declaration of intent without much substance behind it. That's my interpretation. That's the interpretation of many who side with Israel and the US on this matter. And even those who are only pro-Palestinian and anti-Israel, even for them, it's not clear where all of this is going because there was no clear plan presented by all these countries recognizing a Palestinian state. No plan, of course, by them, because the situation is completely different if you ask Israel and the US where things are going. The big moving pieces on the table are several and substantial. It's the question of the end of the conflict in the Gaza Strip, the question of the return of all hostages at once or in a staggered manner, the question of Iran, which I'm going to leave for later to talk about, the question of how Israel relates to what's going on in the Gaza Strip as far as the continued warfare or the ending of it and the timing of that, of course, and the really big piece, what happens to this region? Is it regional peace, regional stability, new financial agreements between Israel, the US, and otherwise, or more of, like we like to say in Israel, this balagan, the mess of what's been created by Iran and other countries trying to stir up drama and events in this region? Well, let's break that all down because there's a lot of moving pieces here. So first of all, the countries that recognize. You have the French, you have the British, you have several other countries who recognized a Palestinian state without any clear plan of what they're planning to do. This is done more than anything to appease their audiences, their demographics, their constituents. It's done to show a vote against Israel and against the American agenda. It's done to show their intent towards ending the war in the Gaza Strip, but it also shows the emptiness and the lack of long-term planning in these kind of declarations. There is no clear leadership for this Palestinian state that they're recognizing, and there is no clear plan for what's going to happen in Gaza and the day after. Let's dive into further detail on what is actually happening in the UN with the various countries' votes and speeches that are made. Now, the headlines have been dominated by the handful of countries that were joined to the list of countries that recognize the Palestinian state. Now, mind you, even before this week's events, many countries around the world, most Muslim countries, most Arab countries, and many others, for various agendas and reasons, have recognized the Palestinian state. Does that make a substantial difference on the ground here in Israel? Not really, but it's already happened. But what is different now is these large and more dramatic states, the Canadians, the French, the British, these are superpowers. These are heavyweighters in the world of diplomacy that have now made a public declaration that is, to the best of my understanding and our understanding, is against Israel, pro-Palestinian, and in a way also pro-Hamas. But it's not all negative. Quite a few countries have been far more hesitant to just automatically click with this message and have said, wait, let's see where things are going. We want the hostages back. We understand we want to end the conflict in the Gaza Strip, but not at any cost, not at the cost of Hamas remaining in power. That's a really big thing for many different players. Italy is a great example of this. And Prime Minister Meloni, she goes out and she says the following. She says, yes, we want to end the war in Gaza. Yes, we want to have an end and a ceasefire, but we also believe all the hostages should be returned. And we need to see how this process, how this change results in Hamas not being in leadership in the Gaza Strip. And this message has been heard from multiple other governments, both on the UN General Assembly stage and also behind closed doors. And here's the big piece you're probably not hearing about in international news. Most Arab countries, the people who actually stand to pay and both the financial cost and the political cost for these kind of decisions and the stability or instability that they create in this region, most Arab countries are on the side of the US, and because of that, Israel. Not an automatic recognition of a Palestinian state, but rather they want to rebuild the Gaza Strip. They want a ceasefire. They want a clear plan to remove Hamas, which is the enemy not just of Israel, but of multiple other countries, ideologically speaking. They want a hostage return that is swift and conclusive, and they want to rebuild the Middle East when it comes to financial incentives and everything that goes together with that. Now here's where it gets interesting. The state of Israel presents its agenda on this topic through the speech given by Prime Minister Netanyahu on Friday morning or Friday afternoon for us. I watched that entire speech. It was a dramatic, a powerful, a meaningful speech that clearly states Israel's agenda and Israel's actions in recent months. And if you want to hear a message that is contrary to what anti-Israel and only one-sided media presents, you should listen to that speech because he clearly outlines what's truly happening here in Israel and what Israel has done to minimize wounded people and killed on the Palestinian side in Gaza, what we've done to try to bring a ceasefire, the desire and the need to bring an end to the hostage situation altogether, and our relationship with the United States. A lot of very important topics. Israel is looking at this entire thing, as is heard through the words of both Prime Minister Netanyahu and others in our government. Israel looks at all of this and says the following: we want to end the war swiftly, but we want the hostages back. We're willing to work together with the US, but we need all hostages at once. And most importantly, we need to know that the day after this agreement and ceasefire kicks into action, that the Hamas is no longer in the government, is no longer the governing body of the Gaza Strip. Without that, and without the full return of hostages, there simply is no point in moving forward with an agreement. Another point of contention between Israel and, of course, the US and the international community is the question of Judea and Samaria. What happens in Judea and Samaria on the day after? Because we talked about Gaza a lot. There's a conversation about the hostages and rebuilding the Gaza Strip and the governance in the Gaza Strip. But very few people have a clear plan of what's happening in Judea and Samaria. But Israel's thinking about this topic, as is the United States. Now that brings us to the really next big point, which is the US 21-point plan. Now let's break this down. We've been teasing this topic for multiple days. The US government has been teasing this topic for 4 or 5 days at this point, actually closer to a week as we record this. And I want to break down all the important details that are in the US 21-point plan. So what does the US 21-point plan include? Let's go through the list carefully. First and foremost, an immediate and final end to the Gaza war the minute this agreement takes effect. The second thing is the release of all, emphasis on all Israeli hostages within 40 hours of the agreement taking effect. The third thing is a large-scale prisoner release, thousands of prisoners possibly, between 100 and 200 lifer heavy-duty terrorists. The fourth thing is a gradual IDF drawdown or removal of forces from the Gaza Strip that is tied to both the return of the hostages and Hamas being removed. The fifth thing is the return of all the evacuated people into Gaza to their previous home or place of location. The sixth thing is a massive humanitarian surge through the UN and other international mechanisms that will help fund and bring aid into the Gaza Strip. The seventh thing is an Arab or international force that functions to collect the Hamas weapons, demilitarize the area, and oversee the security transition to something that is not Hamas. The eighth point is governance. First of all, have an interim Arab-led international entity that is invited by the Palestinian Authority and manages the civilian day-to-day. The ninth thing, of course, is a Palestinian committee that's in part done in cooperation with the Palestinian Authority that runs Gaza under an Arab or international oversight. The 10th point is security envelope, is a monitored, substantial perimeter between Israel and the Gaza Strip. Point 11 is reconstruction of the Gaza Strip, a 5+ year plan that uses Arab and international aid to rebuild the Gaza Strip. Number 12 is the Hamas exclusion from governance, which means no Hamas in the Gaza Strip, and possible amnesty to the people that are leaving the Gaza Strip. Point 13 is no attacks on Qatar, which is interesting in my mind, while it mediates, and Qatar channel to reactivate the implementation of this agreement. Point 14 is a commitment by the US for no West Bank annexation during the process. Point 15 is a stability of the West Bank and Jerusalem and protection of the holy sites to curb any future escalation in this region. Point 16 is government reforms to enable effective administration both in Gaza and the Palestinian Authority. 17 is direct Israeli-Palestinian negotiations. 18 is ceasefire monitoring, international and regional verification, and a snapback mechanism for any violations specifically by Hamas. Point 19 is the border crossing with phased procedures for aid, trade, and travel in and out under, of course, inspection of the international community. Point number 20 is counter-smuggling regime, is preventing weapons and other things from entering through the sea or underground. And point 21, and the final point, is a regional rehabilitation and rebuilding track, which ties into the Abraham Accords and the expansion and broader normalization steps that need to be made. It's important to note that these notes on what exactly is in the US 21-point plan have come from multiple sources that don't all exactly align with each other, and we're relying on the best sources available as we record this segment. I want to focus for just an instant on what this all means for Israel. what the Trump 21-point plan means for the state of Israel and for this region. Well, a couple things. First of all, it's positive. This is something we've been looking forward to for a really, really long time. And the fact that it's taking place is a good thing, because action is always better, and a plan is always better than inaction and more of just the same, waiting for things to develop on their own momentum, as we've been doing for a while right now. Now, that's important to note. Another thing that's incredibly important to note is that this affects Israeli policy in Judea and Samaria, and as it relates to the Iranians. Because this regional agreement, this 21-point plan, one, it puts a halt to Israeli activity in Judea and Samaria to a certain degree. It pumps the brakes on some of the construction projects, etc., but it's not clear what exactly it means, and it might be more of a lip service than actual plan or prohibition on building anything in Judea and Samaria. Israel is very concerned of the Iranians pushing back for a nuclear capability and program, as they have before. And we're really happy with the automatic snapback mechanism that just kicked into place, and we're hoping it keeps getting imposed. The main goal here, the main bigger picture, is the fact that the US plan, the 21-point Trump plan, together with the Iranian snapback mechanism, that's all the same picture as far as Israel is concerned. Not separate stories, not different agendas, one big agenda where we get stability, we get checks and balances that prevent the Iranians from going back for a nuclear program, we get safety at our border with Gaza and within Israel with the Palestinian Authority, and hopefully financial prosperity and stability for this entire region all at once. Let me summarize everything that's been happening. There's multiple plays taking place here, but all of them are leading in the same direction. It's the Qataris once again in the negotiation, the Americans with a clear plan, Israel who stated that we want to end this conflict and return all the hostages, Arab countries in this region making a clear statement that they're supportive of a more comprehensive deal and removal of Hamas from the Gaza Strip. Very likely, multiple entities that have put up a commitment to make financial contributions to rehabilitate the Gaza Strip and replace the Hamas government in the Gaza Strip. All of that packages together to a very positive momentum coming out of the UN Convention. There is a very big, substantial negative side to all of this conversation that relates to the fact that multiple countries have, on their own, unilaterally, without recognizing Israel's role in this, declared that they recognize the Palestinian state without any clear plan forward. That does indicate a negative shift in events. But overall, the US 21-point plan, Israel's agenda, the Qataris being back in the picture once more, all of these pull us to the belief, the faith, the optimism that we're moving in a positive direction. What does that mean? That means sometime soon, a Qatari brokered and US brokered deal that removes Hamas from Gaza, that possibly has amnesty for Hamas leaders, that possibly has all the hostages back within days, or the vast majority of them within days. It allows a snapback mechanism to remain in place on the Iranians, and world peace. Well, I'm joking about the last part, but close enough. Everything moving in a positive direction. Now, in international relations, you never get everything that you want all at the same time, but as far as things go, this is a push in the right direction. And I hope, I pray, I believe that we're moving in that positive trajectory. Now back to Yair Pinto.
Thank you, Mati. And before we continue to Iran, I want to share some thoughts about some of the things that we've seen over the last week. Europe is struggling over its identity, as many ordinary people fear the loss of national identity and also feel threatened by continued illegal immigration and the spread of Islam. These concerns have been manifested in large rallies held in several European countries, grassroots political campaigns, and widespread discontent. But the self-described elites in European society have largely dismissed these efforts as the work of fringe extremists, hate groups, and so on. These so-called elite have nothing but contempt for anyone who doesn't want to go along with their agenda or who don't agree with their ideology. This typical conduct of the continent's so-called elites, and especially government leaders, most of whom are identified with the left of the political spectrum, was expressed in the urge to recognize a Palestinian state. This constitutes a reward for Hamas, which carried out the October 7 massacre and led the Middle East, which was on the brink of expanding the Abraham Accords, culminating in the Israeli-Saudi normalization agreement, into a devastating war that includes multiple countries. The destruction in the Gaza Strip is entirely the fault of Hamas, but that is a fact that many of these so-called elites find inconvenient, so they simply ignore it. The detachment of Europe's leaders from a basic understanding of the Middle East alongside their continued efforts to appease radicals there is illustrated in the words of Britain's Prime Minister and the leader of the left-wing Labour Party, Keir Starmer, who explained why His Majesty's government decided to recognize a Palestinian state. His central claim is that recognizing a Palestinian state is an essential act towards reconciliation and normalization in the Middle East and constitutes a rejection of extremist elements that do not want peace. In response to calls from Britain's opposition parties, the Reform Party and the Conservative Party, who argued that recognizing a Palestinian state at this time is a reward for Hamas terrorism, Starmer replied that this step is the exact opposite of Hamas's vision. The British Prime Minister even pledged that the Palestinian state under Abu Mazen's leadership would be demilitarized and undergo reforms, and that Hamas would not be part of future governments there. Despite Starmer's declaration regarding Hamas, a position that, as noted, reflects a prevalent view amongst many of Europe's leaders, who are mostly on the left side of the political spectrum, it is important to note that the Palestinian people think otherwise. In May of 2025, a public opinion poll was conducted by the Palestinian Center for Policy and Survey Research think tank led by Professor Khalil Shikaki, who has been conducting public opinion polls in the West Bank and Gaza Strip since 1993 every quarter. This poll clearly shows that the Palestinian public wants to see Hamas in power. In this context, I think it's also important to note that Hamas was one of the first to issue a statement thanking the United Kingdom, Britain, and other Western governments for issuing recognition of a Palestinian state. If, as Prime Minister Keir Starmer and other Western leaders of states claim this move is against the interests of Hamas, then why is Hamas so happy about it? It is amazing to me that none of these European elites ever bothered to ask the Palestinian people, who they claim to care about so much, what they really think about anything and why they ignore these kinds of public statements by terrorist groups. This is something called the soft racism of low expectations, when Western governments tell the world that non-Western people and countries really want and really believe something while completely ignoring what these non-Western people, organizations, and governments are actually saying and actually doing. And for that matter, on the European left, there will still be those who claim that Hamas is a legitimate organization that represents the Palestinian people and that Israel must negotiate with it. Indeed, Europe's naivety about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict reinvents itself every time, and therefore the Jewish state must also prepare for the day when there will be those who say that Palestinian democracy, even if it chooses terror and violence, is what must be taken into account. After all, the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip voted for Hamas the last time an election was held there. In any case, here at TBN Israel, we will continue to report on every development in this issue, so keep spreading the truth, share, follow us, and most importantly, pray for the situation. And if you want to help us to reach more people on YouTube, hit that subscribe button. That's how the algorithm works. Now, we switch our focus to the news from Iran. Overnight between Saturday and Sunday, the snapback sanctions, this is a mechanism that was part of the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action nuclear deal endorsed by the United Nations Security Council, went into effect. This followed a failed effort by diplomats from China and Russia to delay the decision. It also follows several weeks in which Iran has refused to give serious consideration to several proposals that were made to try and restart nuclear negotiations with the United States and with European powers, as well as their stubborn refusal to cooperate with the International Atomic Energy Agency. Therefore, following the Security Council's green light, the heavy sanctions returned to force 10 years after they were removed. These sanctions will include an arms embargo, a ban on enrichment and reprocessing of uranium, a ban on launching ballistic missiles capable of carrying nuclear warheads or engaging in activities related to such missiles, and on transferring technology related to ballistic missiles. It also includes freezing Iranian assets worldwide and banning the entry of Iranian individuals and Iranian companies to various countries, as well as authorization for states to conduct searches of aircraft and ships of Iranian airliners and shipping companies to make sure that they do not contain prohibited goods. Iranian officials immediately began to protest that the United Nations had no authority to impose them, that the European governments had no moral or legal grounds for taking these actions, and so on. However, in Europe and in the United States, they emphasized immediately upon the sanctions entry into force that this does not end diplomacy. US Secretary of State Marco Rubio called on Tehran to agree to direct talks in good faith, while asking all countries to implement the sanctions immediately in order to apply pressure on Iran. For their part, the E3, Britain, France, and Germany issued a joint statement saying that Iran has repeatedly violated its commitments under the nuclear agreement, and there was no choice but to activate the snapback mechanism. Our countries will continue to strive for diplomatic avenues and negotiations. The countries also noted that these decisions are not new. They include a set of sanctions and other restrictive measures previously imposed by the Security Council and addressed Iran's proliferation activities. These steps were lifted when Iran committed to maintaining a nuclear program for peaceful purposes only. Once it violated its commitments, we were forced to return the decisions to force. In August, European negotiating teams informed the Security Council that Iran had violated almost all the commitments. They gave Tehran a month to mend its ways, but talks held with Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi and other officials did not provide evidence for Iran's willingness to return to a diplomatic track. The Europeans demanded full cooperation with the agency, access to nuclear sites, and an accounting for more than 400 kilograms of enriched uranium, but received no answer. So in my humble opinion, the Ayatollah regime has only itself to blame for the bad situation that it finds itself in, but I'm not at all surprised to see them blaming everybody else but themselves. We all know individuals who act like this, and psychologists actually have a term for it, and that term is narcissism. It's bad enough when an individual acts like this, but when a regime which rules over one of the world's most geostrategically important countries with a population of around 75 million people and a large percentage of the world's energy reserves acts like this, that's bad news for everybody on this planet, not just the Iranians or the Israelis. In any case, Western intelligence agencies assess that direct economic impact of renewing the sanctions will be limited, since heavy American sanctions are already in effect on Iran. Nevertheless, there are political and diplomatic implications, especially in the future if an initiative for a new nuclear agreement is renewed. It is unclear whether Europe would join another lifting of sanctions. For its part, the International Atomic Energy Agency announced that its inspectors began work at Iranian nuclear facilities this week, but the chairman of the National Security Committee in Iran's parliament, Ibrahim Aziz, completely denied this. Aziz claimed that inspection activities at the nuclear facilities that were damaged are only the wishful thinking of the agency's director, Rafael Grossi, and defined the report of the presence of agency inspectors as media lies. In a statement he delivered on Friday, Aziz also said that he contacted the officials of Iran's Atomic Energy Organization, and they denied the arrival of the IAEA inspectors. He accused Grossi of seeking to realize the American objective and claimed that the Americans want to know what happened to our nuclear sites. Meanwhile, Iran's President Masoud Pezeshkian declared that the United States demanded the handover of all enriched uranium and materials in Iran. He added that Iran reached an agreement with the Europeans on this issue, but the United States' position was different. The Iranian president emphasized that his country prefers to remain under sanctions rather than hand over all the uranium to the Americans. And once again, no one should be surprised by this. The Ayatollah regime, which rules Iran, has demonstrated over and over again that it does not care about their own people as long as they can continue their nuclear program and other malign activities. So keep spreading the truth, share these videos with everybody who wants to know what's happening in Israel. This is our best way to fight all these lies, all these propagandas. So if you like it, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Now, switching our focus to Israel's northern arena, the Israeli Kan news portal reported on Saturday evening that the Hezbollah terrorist organization in Lebanon is preparing for a scenario in which the state of Lebanon will try to seize its weapons by force. Hezbollah Secretary General Naim Qassem spoke on Saturday evening at the rally in memory of Hassan Nasrallah, 1 year after his assassination. In his speech, Qassem called on the Lebanese government to fulfill its obligations in terms of Lebanon's rehabilitation, Israel's withdrawal, the cessation of hostilities in its strikes, and the release of the Lebanese prisoners held by Israel. He also declared that his organization will not disarm and demanded that the Lebanese government must place national sovereignty at the top of its priorities and not allow Israel to remain in Lebanon. Despite the devastating defeat that it suffered at the hands of Israel in the last year's conflict, Hezbollah does not appear to have lost its desire to confront the IDF, and at the same time, it is also making preparations to try and engage with the Sunni jihadists who have taken over Syria, led by Abu Muhammad al-Jolani. Hezbollah is very troubled by al-Jolani's policies, particularly his moves to establish good relations with Israel. There's also an open account between Hezbollah and these Sunni jihadist groups, which goes back over a decade to Hezbollah's intervention in the Syrian civil war. How will that account be settled? We might be able to find out very soon. And now, we will move to a very important diplomatic report. The United States ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee, is expected to visit Cairo in the coming days and hold talks with senior Egyptian officials. This was announced to the New York Times by the United States Embassy spokesperson in Jerusalem on Saturday evening, against the backdrop of tense relations between Israel and Egypt following the war in the Gaza Strip. 3 officials in the United States and the Middle East told the American newspaper that the talks will focus on the war in Gaza and that this is the first official visit to Egypt by a sitting U.S. ambassador to Israel in decades. And amongst other things, Huckabee is expected to meet with Egypt's foreign minister, Badr Abdelati. The officials who spoke with the New York Times said that Huckabee is expected in his visit to address the tensions between the two countries, and 2 of them added that the talks will also deal with the new American plan to end the war in Gaza, which President Trump shared with Arab and Muslim leaders on the sidelines of the United Nations General Assembly this week. It should be noted that Egypt receives significant military aid from the United States of America, and it should also be noted that it is still unclear what role will be played in the talks by the United States ambassador to Egypt, Hero Mustafa Garag, who was appointed during the Biden administration. Egypt criticized the military operation that the IDF began this month in Gaza, where nearly 1 million Palestinians lived under recently, out of concerns that the fighting could force hundreds of thousands of Gazans across the Egyptian border into the Sinai Peninsula. So that hasn't happened, and Israeli officials recently expressed concerns to Washington regarding Egypt's military buildup in the Sinai Peninsula, which borders Israel and also Gaza. Egypt's government declared last week, in response to reports about troop buildup at the border, that the forces are in Sinai to defend the state's borders against all threats. Egypt also denied Israel's claims that the deployment of forces were constituted a violation of the peace treaty between Egypt and Israel. Egypt's Foreign Minister, Badr Abdelati, delivered a speech last night at the United Nations General Assembly in which he harshly attacked Israel over the war in the Gaza Strip and warned of harm to the stability to the entire region. And during his speech, he said that Israel is waging a brutal war against civilians in Gaza. The credibility of the international system is being eroded due to the violations of international law, and the Middle East is on the verge of explosion. We are looking at the reality in the Middle East with concern and responsibility. We warn against the continuation of their irresponsible Israeli policy, which closes the door to the hopes of the people of this region for coexistence in peace. Our hand is extended for peace, and President el-Sisi affirms this peace is our strategic choice. And here at TBN Israel, we will continue to bring you all the truth about what's happening in Israel. So keep supporting, sharing, leaving a comment, hitting the like button, and make sure to subscribe to this channel to help us reach more people. But the most important thing that you can do is pray. So let's unite in prayer for wisdom to all the leaders around the world to make the right choices related to this conflict. Let's pray for the idea of soldiers fighting inside Gaza, for their families, for their children, for their jobs to survive this intense time. Let's pray for all the innocent lives, the Palestinian people in Gaza that are now moving south to humanitarian zones. Let's pray for them to be safe as Hamas is trying to use them as human shields. Let's pray for all the civilians in Syria, in Lebanon, in Yemen, to not be affected by all the fake information related to Israel. Let's pray for them to have God in their heart and to start loving the Jewish people instead of hating us. Let's keep praying for the peace of Jerusalem.